Hey, everybody. Hope you enjoyed tonight's wonderfully informative Republican convention. These things in both parties are really no longer conventions in any meaningful sense. I mean, they've been stripped of any actual procedural meaning consistently over the past several decades, really. But they've really, this year, because of COVID, gotten what they wanted in a way by just dispatching with any pretense that these are anything but a made-for-TV television propaganda spectacle. And that was the same last week with the Democrats, and it's clearly the same this week with the Republicans. So in watching them, you almost get a sense that it's even more pointless than usual. There were a few notable items, I think, tonight. I put Kimberly Guilfoyle in the thumbnail of this video because just from an aesthetic or acoustic standpoint, her speech was just unbearable. I mean, I literally almost had to turn it off just because it was so unbearable to listen to her screeching. I mean, it was worse than Hillary screeching, and Hillary screeching will go down in the annals of history as amongst the most tedious ways in which anybody can ever hope to project their voices. So that was bad. And again, Kimberly, I just don't understand. Maybe I'm oblivious, but I would think that Kimberly Guilfoyle would look perfectly fine without plastic surgery. I mean, why would you want it so that anybody that you meet ever is immediately confronted with the obvious reality that you got substantial plastic surgery? If you're going to get plastic surgery, isn't the idea that you want it to be subtle? That you want it to maybe correct minor imperfections? That you want it to be not so glaringly conspicuous? I'm just not in the frame of mind of anybody who would ever even contemplate getting plastic surgery, so maybe I'm missing something here. But I could barely even listen to what Kimberly Guilfoyle was saying because everything about her was just so off. But, you know, more power to her, I guess. The overarching theme that comes across at this convention, and that comes across in the wider Republican messaging, because Trump's messaging and Republican messaging are essentially one and the same. If there was any distinction in 2016, which there probably was around the margins to some degree, it's been utterly erased. Now, the main theme is that they are running against the ascendant radical left, as they put it. Now, let me make one thing clear. There's a reasonable case to be made that the radical activist left is ascendant. I'm not denying that. If you followed anything that I've done over the past few months, you'll know that I set out to document, at least in part, the fruits of what the radical left unleashed in the course of this protest / riot movement. I mean, there are bona fide radical leftists out there, and it does appear on a number of levels that they've gained more power and influence than had previously been the case. So I don't deny that necessarily. However, you reach into absurd territory when you do things like compare Joe Biden to Fidel Castro. I mean, come on. That's just out of the old movement conservative playbook, and it probably was said about every Democratic nominee going back to 1980. And it's just not tenable in the case of Joe Biden in particular. I have plenty of criticisms of Joe Biden. I could spend the rest of the night elaborating on them, and there would still be many more to get to. The idea that he has anything in common with Fidel Castro, I mean, it stretches the bounds of reasonable critique to an almost absurd degree. And do Democrats also do this with Trump? Yeah, they do when they run around shrieking that we're on the verge of fascism or that we've even been living under fascism. AOC, a few nights ago, put on her Instagram stories that she believes that the 2020 election comes down to fascism being on the ballot. Or in other words, the question facing voters is, do we want to live in a fascist country or not? And if not, the need is to vote Trump out and vote Biden in. So that's a ridiculously histrionic depiction of the current political conditions as well. But so too is the idea that Joe Biden embodies totalitarian communism or something. I mean, please. I could see how that might get you a lot of shares on Facebook, or how it might rile up some talk radio listeners, but it's just analytically preposterous. But that's sort of a theme that's recurring over the course of the Republican messaging, and I think it's perilous for Trump in the following sense. In 2016, Trump's messaging was effective, in large part because he was positioning himself against the failed bipartisan status quo. He defeated the reigning Republican dynasty, the Bushes, and then he went on to defeat the reigning Democratic dynasty in the Clintons. And that was like a perfect storm for Trump, who was the consummate outsider, right? Not quite, but that's the public image he was presented. It has some validity to it in that he hadn't risen through the ordinary ranks that a politician would rise through in order to achieve the pinnacle of political power. And so he could attribute all the ills bedeviling contemporary society to the bipartisan elites who ran the country. And did it have a rightward tinge to it most of the time? Yeah, but it was also pretty heterodox compared to the orthodoxies that had been operative for the Republican Party for decades. I can recall, like, the minute that Trump was elected, Mike Pence, who was just a movement conservative guy, Christian conservative, he was discussing what the upcoming administration would do. And he's like, yeah, we're not all that into free trade anymore. Just like, okay, wow, that means you can pretty quickly do away with the key pillars of a party's self-conception. And yet there was little of that similar spirit or sentiment or vision on display tonight, nor has there been really much of the Trump re-election campaign messaging. And in a way, that's to be expected because he's the incumbent president now. So you can't just totally run against the status quo. You are partly the status quo. You've been running the federal government for 4 years. But it does diminish the salience, I think, of the pro-Trump argument in a way that they haven't really come to grips with. They haven't figured out the correct alternative. And then so for the only tool in your arsenal really to kind of concoct a fantasy version of Joe Biden, as though he has anything remotely in common with Fidel Castro. I mean, that's just silly season. Because the current status quo that Trump could potentially run on isn't all that great, to put it mildly, with COVID and everything else, with the riots which have occurred under his watch. People blame disorder and chaos on the incumbent president, whether you like it or not. Trump really hadn't, I don't think, marshaled the advantages of incumbency even before COVID, such that I really ever thought that he was necessarily the favorite to win. And you can go and check my comments about that going back a while. So I'm not a Johnny come lately on this, just going with the polls. And so putting so much stock in this hammering of the drum about the radical left, I just don't think is as persuasive as the Trump 2016 case. And maybe they'll get a miracle, and there's something will turn, and people will find that more persuasive than I can presently gauge. But we're not getting It's Morning in America here, like 1984 or something. If like there's a you could imagine a scenario where Trump just had to purely run on his successful record in order to make the case for his reelection, but he has to now get into the weeds of erecting a almost unrecognizable version of his opponent, which that was going to happen regardless to some extent. It's just a matter of emphasis, and at least judging by tonight, that was heavily emphasized. Although in the beginning, anyway, they did devote a few segments to COVID. And what's interesting to me, and I'm sure people in this chat will confirm what I'm about to say, is that the Republican RNC messaging on COVID is starkly divergent from the type of messaging you see online from Trump supporters who still are in almost denial mode. They say it's a hoax. They call it fear porn. They'll quote extremely dubious statistics at you, trying to convince you that you're overreacting or the masks don't work or whatever. Apparently, that's not a political winner as per the Trump campaign and the RNC, because they went out of their way to cast COVID as a historic disaster and not downplay the severity of it, but hold up what they have cast as the effective response by Trump to it, the strong, tough, uncompromising, whatever response. So the denialists that I'm sure are going to be in this chat, on my Twitter feed, in the comments, whatever, you are out of step. You are not at all representative of how most voters think about this issue. Do you come across people who have these denialist views in real life? Yes, I have. But the average voter? No, because, I mean, it's just too real. And that's why Trump, he spoke to people who, tonight, in pre-recorded segments, had the virus. Spoke to nurses who went around the country to hotspots and dealt with the virus. So it's insane at this point that you still see so much denialism. And when I say denialism, I'm not necessarily referring to reasonable debates over the correct policy response. I'm talking about the unempirical, very low IQ, wholesale refusal to acknowledge reality. And a lot of these people tend to be MAGA conspiracy types, and I still don't know how they square that with the messaging from Trump, which is totally contradictory to the denialism. A few other things. I think maybe the worst moment was Nikki Haley speaking, who she actually went out of her way to invoke a relatively obscure neocon figure, Jean Kilpatrick. Not obscure if you're familiar with the history of the neoconservative movement, but obscure to the average voter, I'm sure. But she went out of her way to invoke Jean Kilpatrick, and single-handedly, Nikki Haley is keeping the neocon legacy alive. That was, and keeping it alive by ensuring that it's within the mainstream, or framing it as within the mainstream of the ordinary pro-Trump America First agenda. It's clear that's what her political project is. And because she's on good terms with Trump and is selected to speak, and filters her neocon ideology through this pro-Trump prism, she's sort of maintaining a foothold in a variety of different factions within the Republican Party. So draw your own conclusions as to what that portends potentially for the future. There was a pretty embarrassing moment early on when Charlie Kirk, who, like, the hardcore MAGA people will tell me, oh, Charlie Kirk is just a grifter. He doesn't represent the MAGA agenda. And yet everywhere you turn, Charlie Kirk is hoisted up by Trump himself as the ideal, I guess, youth representative of his movement. And so he was, if I'm not mistaken, the very first speaker. So he was like introducing the entire night's proceedings. And he actually said that Trump is, quote, the bodyguard of Western civilization. Again, I mean, I'm aware that hyperbole is going to suffuse these things. That's a given. But you can make a case that you want a Republican in office, even you want a Trump-specific Republican in office, given, I don't know, his governing triumphs in your mind, without that, like, framing it in these like cosmic world historic terms, like Trump is the sole guardian of Western civilization. What? I think that's foolish. There were times where it did get a little cult-like tonight. And that would be one example, but then you wouldn't expect much more from Charlie Kirk, who's just, that's his entire reason for existence. Herschel Walker, the former NFL star, declared that Trump is in favor of, quote, social justice. So that's a new one. I didn't expect that to be in the Trump re-election arsenal, that he's the true social justice warrior. Very interesting. And yeah, a few other observations, I guess. Next week I'll have some. I'm still working on my thing from the Democratic Convention last week. Well, I'll put out some more comprehensive thoughts on this eventually. Let's go through a few super chats. Paul Henning says, Andrew Pollock stood next to Rick Scott as he signed gun control legislation in Florida. He whitewashed this at his convention speech. I would have to double check that that's accurate, but I don't have any reason to doubt you. That sounds right to me if I'm recalling the aftermath of the Parkland shooting correctly in terms of the legislative response in Florida. Yeah. I guess the idea is that whatever gun control action that was taken there was more sensible and Second Amendment protecting than the Democratic version, which they're inveighing against. But you're right. I mean, you would assume that listening to that speech from the father of a victim of the Parkland shooting, that they were wholesale against all gun control measures, when clearly that's not true. Sparky has a few comments, one of which is both parties' establishment combined for uniparty. Does that include Trump at this point? Sparky, I have to ask you. I mean, he's pretty much the establishment of the party right now. I don't know how that could be denied. Estev says, Haley reminds me of the Republican version of Tulsi. I don't think so. Unless you're just talking about the fact that they're women and they have somewhat atypical ethnic backgrounds. And if that's the case, that's a pretty superficial comparison, I would say. Their foreign policy philosophies could not be more at odds. Krillin says, I think Gov response is somewhere in the middle. Not great, not horrible. If you look at Hopkins' slate, we are in the middle of the Euro countries in mortality. I don't know that you could look solely at mortality rate. I mean, the virus did hit Europe earlier, so theoretically we would have had more time to prepare and to mitigate the spread. And I think the fact that we had a second wave or a continuation or escalation of the first wave in additional states this summer is an America-specific failure. Now, maybe you're fine with that. Maybe 1,000 plus people dead every day is acceptable to you, and you don't care, or you think the numbers are faked or something. You think Ron DeSantis in Florida is like fabricating his death statistics for whatever reason, or Greg Abbott in Texas is doing that. I don't know why they'd be doing that. It seems like that would be contrary to their interests. But if that's your view, okay. But from a standpoint of responsible governance, effective state response to a massive societal problem, that second wave, to me, was the most straightforward evidence that the American government's response was relatively bad. And, does it mean that Trump could have single-handedly solved the problem? No, it doesn't. But there are certain things that were so, within his purview that went pretty badly wrong. And, he's touting his response as one of his arguments for re-election. So it's got to be scrutinized. Sparky claims that he ran track with Herschel Walker. Okay. Did you ever beat him in a race? I'd be interested to know. Mock Rossi asks, did you see Vosh and Pacman Russiagate recently? What does that mean exactly? That they debated Russiagate, that they discussed Russiagate, that they Russiagated one another? I'm not sure exactly what that means. But either way, no, I did not see whatever you're talking about there. Oh yeah, another strange moment where Don Jr. Delivered an address, and his eyes were all welled up as if he had just finished crying before he started speaking. People were speculating that maybe he smoked a giant blunt before talking, which seems doubtful to me. Strange. I'm sure Donald Trump Sr. noticed that, given how spectacularly attuned he is to the aesthetics of television production. Supposedly, I read this convention is being produced by somebody who was involved in The Apprentice. under Mark Burnett, who was the executive producer or whatever, and ran Survivor and everything. I mean, the fact that our politics have been handed over to the reality TV moguls is kind of amazing. Estev asked, "What do I think of Richard Spencer reportedly endorsing Biden?" Did he? I don't think he endorsed him. I saw his tweet where he just said he will be voting for him because he believes he's more competent. I don't think Richard Spencer or any other white nationalist is going to be voting for Biden because they think Biden's going to institute a white nationalist friendly agenda. At least according to what I read, he thinks that Biden would just be a more competent administrator. And that's open for debate, but the administrative competency of Trump, I think, is reasonably called into question by the past 6 months. All right, that'll do it for now. I can't believe we have 3 more nights of this. I mean, 8 days of convention watching is too much. They need to condense this stuff, I think. We all have better things to do. Like the NBA is on right now, for example, which I'm going to go watch. I haven't been following that closely, the NBA bubble, playoff, whatever. But, because something in my brain doesn't even click that it's available to watch right now in late August. But I do recall now. So I'm going to go watch the Lakers and Trailblazers, if I'm not mistaken. Hopefully it's still on. I didn't just blow my opportunity to see a thrilling finish because I was sitting around watching Senator Tim Scott, who, by the way, also one final point. I mean, it is sort of amazing how determined the RNC apparently is to project themselves as the best option for Black Americans, like explicitly on identity grounds. I mean, they hold up that notion proudly. Do they pretty much do just the mirror image of what the Democrats do? They don't reject any of the foundational premises of identity politics, quote unquote, in terms of how you appeal to certain segments of voters. It just got their own ideological twist on it. So I think you had multiple examples of that tonight. The Cuban guy who spoke and was crying, the 2 half Guatemalan girls who were talking about small businesses for some reason, Vernon Jones, this sort of gadfly Democratic state senator from Georgia, and then Tim Scott. At least Tim Scott does have a genuinely impressive story. Although, I mean, he was appointed to his Senate seat initially by Republicans who probably felt it was a good idea to have a Black man in national prominence. But, then he was reelected. So, anyway, the point is that for all the Republican caterwauling about how horrible it is the Democrats traffic in identity politics, which I agree is often very tedious and insufferable and superficial, they do their own version of it. Whether it's effective remains to be seen. Somebody mentions that Nikki Haley appointed him. That's right. She appointed him when Jim DeMint resigned from the Senate to go run the Heritage Foundation. Despite being the most prominent Tea Party Republican in the Senate at that time. And so they got Tim Scott, who's not as ideologically adventurous. He's just sort of a standard middle-of-the-road Republican who ticks a few convenient identity boxes. And not to take away anything necessarily from him. I mean, I think his story about his grandfather picking cotton and then within a generation, his grandson is in the U.S. Senate. That's a genuinely inspiring story in a way. But you can't deny that he's showcased for a particular political reason. STFU FFS says, if Tulsi goes MAGA, will you consider it? She won't. So there's no reason to even entertain that very stupid question. Okay, I will talk to you later, everybody. Stay safe, stay cool, stay COVID free if you believe in it. And even if you don't, I don't want you to have COVID. That would be bad. And there's no conventions happening. So if you had planned on attending, you are now less likely to contract the virus because you're just sitting at home, zombie like, watching it on your computer or TV screen, just like all the rest of us saps. Bye bye.